this lecture will provide an example of how to apply our integrative framework to a specific approach to psychological counseling. And so basically, the title of this lecture is Models of Psychotherapy, focused specifically on cognitive behavioral therapy. And so what we're going to do is we will be talking through the integrative framework that I've developed based on worldview assumptions, and you can see the references there, Frederick 2009, 2012, and we'll be describing how this framework interacts with specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, Beck, Dixon, Krask, and Ellis. So to begin with, just by way of a little bit of background, there are perhaps two big frameworks in cognitive behavioral therapy. The first one is Aaron Beck and his folks that focused mainly on cognitive therapy, and then incorporating some behavioral principles into it. And then Albert Ellis initially developed rational motive therapy, and over time, discussing some of the main kinds of principles and things like that, rational motive therapy turned into rational motive behavioral therapy, or REBT. So most of the research, I would say, is focused on Aaron Beck's CBT, and there are some interesting offshoots of CBT, mindfulness-based therapies, third wave, so to speak, cognitive behavioral therapy, and also then there's some research supporting the Albert Ellis REBT folks. One of the things that I like about REBT better than CBT is that Albert Ellis and his colleagues have developed very clear concepts and schema that kind of tie the REBT's form of cognitive therapy together. It's very teachable, it's very practical, whereas CBT can be a little bit more on the esoteric or ephemeral side. So most of the focus on this lecture is going to be about REBT. Just so keep that in mind, although the things that we talk about will definitely apply to Aaron Beck's form of CBT. So just briefly here, worldview is a very crucial concept that we are focusing on in terms of integrating. So there are many approaches to the integration approach, how to bring Christian perspectives or theology into alignment with and discussion with behavioral science worldviews, in this case specifically psychotherapy. So this is designed or intended as a big perspective or framework to help us think through the issues. So on the Christian side, we can think about cosmology, worldview, or cosmology that is, what's the nature of the world that we live in? Is it a good world? Is it a bad world? Where are we in this universe? Who created the universe? How do we know things? Epistemology is inherently connected to cosmology. So, for example, on the worldview side, if we only have an empirical world, one that is physical, natural, not spiritual, and how we know this world, how we learn about this world is through our empirical senses, taste, touch, sight, hearing, smell. That's the epistemological approach that we take. And there's nothing transcendent. There is no God. There's no spiritual reality. Those are all epistemological claims. And so, of course, on the Christian side, there are epistemological claims as well. Next, who are we is fundamental to this idea of Christian theological anthropology and psychological anthropology. On the Christian side, what we're talking about is what's a Christian perspective on human nature, anthropology, right? The study of man or humankind, and so essentially that's about the doctrine of the image of God and human nature that way. Now, behavioral sciences and psychology in particular, and even narrowing it down further, psychotherapy-specific models have inherent in them an understanding of human nature, what makes people work the way that they do. How do people function? What's their role in this universe, in this nature that we have? That way, psychological anthropology. What's wrong in the world? So that the Christian approach to identifying what is wrong in nature, in the world, is this idea of sin. Right now, at the outset, I want to reiterate and emphasize that I'm not talking about a moralistic kind of browbeating perspective. Why things happen is because of sin in your life, so you need to repent and confess and get on with it. But also, people have sins done to them, and we're born into a fallen and sinful world. Those are all aspects of the Christian answer and understanding what sin is, and how that plays itself out. And so we'll talk a lot more about that. On the psychotherapy, behavioral sciences side, generally speaking, we're talking about abnormal psychology or psychopathology. What's the theory of how people got derailed? What's broken in them? In terms of a sociological lens, we're looking at how societies and social problems work. What creates social problems? How do we address social problems? What societal influences or group influences relate to what's wrong? Sociopathy, in a sense, we're talking about. Finally, we need to think about how do we fix it? What's the answer to this, to what's wrong? Right? Inherent in what's wrong is the solution, how to fix it. So for Christian folk, we're thinking about Jesus Christ's saving work of atonement. What this Christ, right, the cross component in the Christian worldview is the answer. Right? God so loved the world so much that He gave His only begotten Son for us, and so Jesus' birth, life, death, and resurrection is crucial to answering the sin problem. Now, on the psychotherapy model issue side, well, we're talking about psychotherapy, how to fix it, what kinds of techniques are used, how do we address the issues involved, what interventions do we create to fix the problems that we've identified. Now, on the sociological side, there would be things about redressing, changing sociological patterns, societal structures, things like that. And so this framework is foundational to bringing together the Christian worldview, Christian principles, and behavioral science worldview perspectives. Now, again, those are at the broadest level. So this lecture is intended as an example of applying this approach to a specific case, the case of psychotherapy, sort of generally, and cognitive behavioral therapy very specifically. So when we're thinking about this idea of Christian theological anthropology, as we turn to that idea, we need to think about, what does it mean? What's inherent in Christian theological anthropology? Now, traditionally, there have been three main approaches to, or three main dimensions of being made in the image of God, which is the fundamental doctrine of a Christian understanding of human nature. First, being made in the image of God contains functional things. Number one, there are things that people need to do. There are roles that people play. And in a large perspective, this functionality is about our calling to have dominion over the earth, to be stewards or co-laborers with God, to foster, flourish, develop the creation that we're in. And so this idea of what we do, our calling, is tied into this idea of function, co-governing or collaborating with God to develop this created order. Function. Function is also about our activities, the specific things that we do. So from a Christian perspective, some behaviors are clearly moral and some are clearly immoral, and then there are several behaviors that are amoral. And so both at the biggest level, our identity and our function, our role in the world as co-laborers or co-governors with with God, co-regents, right? That is, we in the classic sense, right? The king would send out a regent who would act and behave and function as the king in a specific situation, as an ambassador internationally, so to speak, as a governor in a certain province or city. Those are all regents, representatives of the king, and that's a core piece of the functionality or functional dimension of the image of God. The second dimension of the image of God is this idea of structure, or what faculties do humans have that resemble, reflect God's nature, God's image. And so oftentimes we hear the Christian answer to those things are things like soulishness or cognition or thought, the ability to think or rationality. Sometimes people talk about the ability to make choices. We are free to choose. Free will has been granted to humanity in a way that's not the same as the other created world. And finally, the final dimension of Christian theological anthropology, made in the image of God, is a relational dimension. And so a Christian understanding of God's nature is that God is three in one. The doctrine of the Trinity, that God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit have the same substance, but they have different functions. They operate differently in the created world as well as in the economy of salvation, or how salvation worked itself out, and each one has a specific role in that, and so we can see that God's being is relationality in His sense, and so when we read Genesis 1:26 through 28, we see relationality as a huge component of human nature. Male and female, God created them, and so somehow this unity of coming together as different creatures, as male creatures and female creatures, fundamentally reflects God's relational dimensions that way. So in terms of CBT's approach to understanding function, there are many components to this. So we can think about classical conditioning, which is pairing a stimulus and response. Think about Pavlov and his dog. They rang the bell and they brought the food, and over time, the minute the dog heard the pairing of the bell, they heard the ringing of the bell, it would begin to salivate, right? A classical conditioning understanding. Operant conditioning is where we look at various types of reinforcers, increasing the likelihood of behavior. And so we see that there are positive reinforcers that increase the likelihood of behaviors. There are negative reinforcers that reduce the likelihood of behaviors. And those are all very important kinds of things. So behavior, what people do, in and of themselves, from a CBT perspective, is very important. We also have modeling. That is, modeling is observing a behavior, maybe through videotape, through watching a sibling perform, through watching adults perform. Just observing the behavior teaches it, increases the likelihood of another person doing that behavior, and then shaping is increasing reinforcers until the desired behavior is demonstrated. So if you're trying to teach your dog to do a complicated trick, you incrementally reinforce the behaviors leading up to that trick. And so we shape behavior that way. And so what these approaches or understandings from a CBT perspective about function, human nature, and what people do, is that behaviors matter a lot. How we act in the world is very important. Now, the moral components to that, right? Behavior is behavior. A CBT person would say there are a couple of ways to understanding behavior is does it help us to achieve our desired goals, right? Does it work for us, so to speak? Is it utilitarian, or does it accomplish our goals? Is it teleological, goal-oriented? And then whatever mores or laws or morality of a specific people group. So, for example, if in the United States, if a certain behavior is deemed from the culture as inappropriate, then it becomes inappropriate. Or if there's a law about it, but behavior in and of itself is amoral. It's just things that people do. That's an important perspective that we will talk about later. Next, as we turn to CBT structural dimensions, we can think about a schema. And what a schema is, a simple structure that contains representations of reality contained in one's mind or mental capacity. It's comprised of thoughts, assumptions, beliefs, and these belief systems include functional or rational beliefs and dysfunctional or irrational beliefs, RBs and IBs, and includes them strongly and behaviorally, right? So along with our beliefs, whether they're rational or irrational, they have an emotional valence. They make us feel good, they make us feel bad, so they produce an affective response, as well as they contain behavioral components to them. So they guide our behaviors. They move us toward people, away from people. They help us to behave in a goal-oriented fashion, or they will reduce or be detrimental, counterproductive to our goals. And so this idea of schema is crucial. So we can think about a schema as comprising these three components: an automatic thought, an intermediate belief, and a core belief. So an automatic thought are things that just flittingly flow through your stream of consciousness, mostly conscious, situation specific, very easily changed. That way. So it's the highest level of the schema. An intermediate belief is somewhat conscious. We're somewhat aware of these intermediate beliefs. They're much more general in terms of our behavior, our outlook, our perspective on life. And finally, they are more challenging to change. It takes more time, more effort to modify them. Finally, the core belief is more of a self-statement. It's about my identity, who I am as a person. These are mostly unconscious. They are very general, and they are highly resistant to change. Now, and one of the strengths of the RBT approach is that Albert Ellis and colleagues have spent a lot of time thinking about what are rational versus irrational beliefs. What beliefs are more functional, more healthy, so to speak, ones that help people to move toward their goals and their goal-oriented behaviors, and which ones do not. And so for RABT, we can think about unconditional self-acceptance as a rational thought, right? I need to unconditionally accept myself. I am a good person, generally speaking. And it goes beyond what I do. Just because I exist, I'm a good person, right? I need to unconditionally self-accept who I am. Some days are better than others. I'm not perfect, and I'm moving toward my goals. And another rational thought is unconditional other acceptance. Other people are the same. That is, people are generally good. People are generally trying. There are few people that are genuinely wishing ill toward others, and so as a result, I need to accept other people, give them the benefit of the doubt. I need to give myself the benefit of the doubt. And unconditional life acceptance. Life happens, and I do have control over some things. I don't have control over everything, and I'm going to have good days, I'm going to have bad days. And so life doesn't owe me necessarily anything. I need to do my part, of course, but if I'm the best person on the planet, that doesn't necessarily relate to me having the best life, right? So I need to just accept that things happen to people. Good things happen to people, bad things happen to people. And so these three philosophies, or these three core beliefs, are inherently rational from an Albert Ellis perspective. And they're right, so that would be core beliefs. Those core beliefs would influence our intermediate beliefs, and then finally, most at the surface level, we can discern them through our automatic beliefs that way. So, relationally speaking, we can think about two relational partners. There's some kind of action. Right? People observe a certain behavior in their relational partners. These behaviors induce an experience, and that experience is interpreted. And so depending on whether you are where you're at in terms of USA, UOA, and ULA, Universal Life Acceptance, is going to influence how you interpret that action, which is going to lead to a certain thought or a feeling. So, For example, when one partner comes in home from work or from outside, and maybe they're sort of quiet or not as communicative as before, right, what are the options here? Well, the person experiences distance or silence, and then can interpret that silence. Oh, what did I do? She's mad at me. He's mad at me again. We're going to have a long night because this was just like yesterday and we argued all night long. And so that thought then prompts a response, an action on that partner's part to withdraw, to pull away. Now, there are other interpretations, right? So that action, a person comes home, is more distant or quiet than usual, leads to that experience of distance, but the interpretation is, oh, so-and-so must have had a long day at work, maybe they were really busy, maybe traffic was horrible, maybe they had an argument with the kids in the car, and that thought, that interpretation of that event would lead to perhaps different actions. Give them 5 or 10 minutes to calm down, or maybe they need to go to the bathroom and take care of their business, or whatever that is, which would lead to different actions and then interpretations, right? And on this side, there's a response to that other person's response, right? So there's distance. They're mad at me again. We're probably going to argue, so I'm going to withdraw, right? And then on the other relational partner side, oh, okay, well, yeah, I'm maybe a little angry when I come home. Oh, I noticed that I don't get the welcome that I usually do. They might not be happy to see me, and so again, that leads to another experience and then another thought. And so over the course of time, right, these interpretations based on these actions are reinforced, and they become polarizing. They pull further and further apart, but they can also pull closer and closer together. It depends on the experience and the thought and then people's responses to them. And so cognitive behavioral therapy would take seriously the relationality of human nature and human beings, and those cognitions are intimately reinforced. I mean, we can see, for example, the effect of mother-child interactions on neurons in your brain. We can see how spouses' interactions influence and cause certain parts of the brain to function compared to other parts. So now we turn to what's wrong. In CBT, the notion or idea of what's wrong is ultimately stinking thinking, wrong-headed thinking, holding to other people's thoughts. And so there's this, we can think about an activating event that you observe your partner doing something, and then because of that activating event, there's a belief about that, which leads to a consequence, my response. Taken in total, this is the idea of teleological distress. So I have a belief or an idea of a goal or an assumption about the nature of reality. My spouse should always be loving to me. My spouse should always be accessible to me. My spouse should always be attentive to me. Whatever your assumption, your goal is about an event, a relationship, an experience, and what happens is you notice, you go through discrepancy-based processing, you notice that that event doesn't live up to your ideal. Right? That triggers a belief, which in turn makes us feel and do something. Right? And so ultimately, when we're looking at psychopathology or this idea of teleological distress, it's cognitive. It's a misinterpretation of events. It's emphasizing more negative evidence compared to more positive evidence in terms of how we assume the world ought to work. And so all this, ironically, all this is experienced emotionally. My feelings, right? I feel like I'm not living up. I'm feeling like my relationship should be better. I feel like I should be treating better, or I deserve to be treated better. Now again, remember that there is no idea here of an inherent morality, right? That some goals are better than others, some behaviors or events are better than others, or that maybe we should feel bad if we violate a law, right? We should feel guilty over something. There isn't any of that here. It is this idea that my assumption is at one spot, is at one level, and the reality I'm experiencing in that moment doesn't measure up, and therefore I believe, right? I'm triggered. I have a certain belief, which leads to further emotional, cognitive, and behavioral outcome. So next, so we talked about what's wrong. Now we're moving to how to fix it. We need to disrupt these irrational thoughts, these irrational beliefs. So there's realistic disputing is one way to dispute irrational thoughts. Is it really true that? Is it really true that she never pays attention to me? Is it really true that I'm horrible at math? Is it really true that I always run into bad traffic on Fridays? That kind of thing. There's logical disputing. Are my beliefs logical? Do they follow from my preferences? Right? Is it logical to assume that my relationships are always going to be positive? Is it? Pragmatic disputing. Does it work for me? Does my belief in X, my assumptions, or this goal help me attain what I want in life? Right? And then develop effective new philosophies or belief systems. So if the answer to my disputing is that it's not really true, no, these beliefs are not logical, and I'll remember part of this logical belief are USA, UOA, and ULA. And so do my beliefs line up to those beliefs? And then how do I modify? What do I need to do to develop new ones? How do I practice? What kinds of self-talk do I need to engage in? How do I need to shift my attention from one type of evidence to another? Right? So I develop new effective philosophies based on this disrupting irrational thoughts. So most importantly, CBT psychotherapy strives to show people how to accept themselves, others, in the world realistically and unconditionally. UOA, ULA, and USA. It accepts the world of probability, uncertainty, and disorder, and it holds no absolutes and encourages flexibility, as Ellis and Ellis talk about in their book, Rational Motive Behavioral Therapy. So the locus of change in this sense is on modifying faulty schemas, and behavior and feeling changes will follow. Right? We need to address the cause of bad irrational behaviors and effective behaviors and poor affect. Finally, we turn to CBT's worldview, or their understanding of the nature of the world in which we live. Behavioral and cognitive behavioral theories utilize what's called the social exchange theory. Inherently, this theory argues that humans maximize their benefits and reduce their cost. That is, we are motivated to invest in our relationships and do things, right, work toward our goals to maximize the benefits personally to ourselves, what we perceive to be beneficial, and to reduce our outputs or the costs, right, the energy cost, the financial cost, whatever those costs are, so that we can maximize the benefit for ourselves. So, for example, one implication of this is, why do people go to medical school? Well, because they are delaying the benefit of being a medical doctor, so that they go through medical school and all the challenges they're in postdoc internships, things like that, because the perceived benefit at the end. So why do you raise your children, right? Is because of the anticipated benefits of them caring for you when they're older, right? Why do we treat our spouses more positively than negatively? So that the investments that we put into our relationships will pay off. This model, this overarching social exchange approach, views that humans are inherently rational creatures. Right? We are rational. We are able to go through cost-benefit analysis and come up with and behave in ways that overall maximize our benefits. So Al Duick from Fuller Theological Seminary identifies this approach metaphorically as formism. So the core metaphor of formism is this idea of idea. The therapeutic approach is constructivism, mainly CBT. So what that means is then we use ideas to build the social and the cognitive mental world in which we live, and so this idea, right? We're inherently rational. The idea of logos or knowledge or logic is foundational to what we do, and the way that we interact is built through this construction of maximizing benefits, minimizing and reducing costs, right? And so what we need to do then is to think differently. If there's a social problem, think differently about it. If we aren't maximizing our goals, we aren't achieving our goals, think differently about it. And so this is a very apt description, this idea of formism, or connected to the idea of how important idea is, how the world is constructed, built cognitively, our schema, our automatic thoughts, our intermediate beliefs, are all the filters that we use to interact and interpret the social and physical data received. If that creates teleological distress, the injunction is then we think differently. So inherent in that is an epistemological approach that is empirical, right? We take in our process the information in our world empirically through our touch, sight, sounds, all the different senses that we have. Those stimuli are interpreted cognitively. We make meaning. We construct the meaning about them. Now, if that meaning is more effective, functional, helps us to achieve our goals, then we don't need to think differently. If it does not, then we need to think differently. We need to make an intervention of some sort. So now we're going to turn to a Christian evaluation of CBT. So in returning to this idea of theological anthropology, right, Christianity would say, the image of God would say that function is important. What we do matters. How we act, how we treat other people are matters. But in terms of CBT, we can think about the behavior as being ethically egoistic. That is, there isn't a moral good that is proposed, right? It's not saying that certain behaviors are better than others morally. It's that are your behaviors effective in helping you achieve your goals, right? So those aren't moral goods. They are amoral goods, right? Which is the idea of ethical egoism. That's very different. If part of the functional image of God is this idea of reigning or being co-regents with God in the world, living out a vocational, purposeful existence, that's very different than function. So one area of overlap between the functional approach to the image of God is this emphasis on behavior, positives there. In a bigger perspective, though, in terms of the purposefulness of behavior, a Christian would say that our behavior is inherently purposeful. We are living and doing and being because of the purpose imbibed in us, given to us by our Creator. It's very different. In terms of structure, Christian answers to the structural domain have, as we mentioned earlier, are will, heart, soul, mind. In the New Testament, there's an emphasis or idea on the inner human being, and so Fitzpatrick and Johnson, these authors that I really appreciate, talk about the Bible presenting humans as responsible beings comprised of both an inner person, which includes our brain, our bodies, our physicalities, and an inner person. The outer person is the vehicle through which we move and live in the world, the things we do, and an inner human person, which includes the heart, soul, and mind and will. And so the inner person is the core area which houses one's subjectivity, our feelings, our thoughts, etc. The outer person is the physical body and its action in the environment. What we experience as feelings or moods are physiological responses to thoughts, emotions, and judgments of our inner human person that way. So, which is a Christian understanding of the structure. For cognitive behavioral therapy, the main structure, the important structure, is our schema, which is housed in the mind/brain. It's based in our neurochemistry or neuroprocessing. This idea of relationality, one important quote here from Joel Green is, God's words affirm the creation of the human family in its relation to himself as his counterpart, so that the nature of humanity derives from the human family's relatedness to God. The concept of the imago Dei, the image of God, then is fundamentally relational or covenantal. And it takes as its ground and focus the graciousness of God's own covenantal relations with humanity and the rest of human nature. So as God is relational and enters into profound covenant, I will do this and you will do that, we will be together, I will be your God, you will be my people, kinds of ideas that are unbreakable. That's fundamentally how humans function. We are relational. We, male and female, we engage in these structures, and also as part of that relational dimension is how we relate to creation, how we relate to other creatures. So there's this profound understanding of the constitutionality, that is, how fundamental it is to human nature of relations, compared to the cognitive idea where relations function in terms of reinforcing our cognitive set, right? So our schema, our core beliefs are reinforced throughout our our relationships with other people and the world that we live in. So when we think about doctrine of sin and how that relates to CBT's view of psychopathology, Joel Green talks about sin as being a formative experience. That is, people are formed in communities, either moving toward God or being better and more and more formally disciples of God, or on the other hand, being formed in a community that's more and more godlike. Right? This idea of sacred versus secular. So living in a secular community, driving one away, forming one away from God. We can think about part of sin is this fundamental evil desire for evil, inner evil desire, which is part of the human heart. We can think about how human intent is always ambiguous. There's always a good part to it and a bad part to it. We desire to do good things, as Paul would talk about, but then we always don't act on that, or we not always act on that. Dominion, right? Sin has fundamentally changed the nature of the world in which we live. We live under the power of the sin that was sent into the world through the first human, or Adam. Donald Capps also provides an understanding of sin as an orientation which destroys community, an orientation that impedes God's intention for the world, so that God intended for the world to work in a certain way, and sin has thwarted that. And it's also an orientation that inhabits or destroys individual well-being. So that's a Christian perspective. A CB2 perspective would be that psychopathology, feeling bad, is connected to teleological distress, resulting from faulty beliefs. The main philosophies behind severe depression, anxiety, hostility, rage, and other dysfunctional states, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are, according to RABT, a lack of unconditional acceptance of oneself, others, and life. So fundamentally, from Albert Ellis's perspective, when we cannot or do not unconditionally accept ourselves, others, and life, those are the fundamental rational beliefs that RABT talks about. We experience teleological distress, and then we behave negatively. We don't maximize our benefits and minimize our costs. We don't attain our goals. And so when one perceives an outcome as not conforming to these personal philosophies, we feel bad. We experience negative emotions. So how do we fix that? So from a Christian perspective, we need to think about, there are things that we do. Participating in baptism, Holy Communion, Eucharist, depending on your tradition. Being with other Christians, going to church, engaging in fellowship. We constantly read and study the gospel, and then we regularly hear the preaching of the word. So those are some things that we do from a Christian perspective, to fight against, to work against sin in the world, sin in ourselves. The goal of this is being more Christ-like, being representing more and more of Christ's nature and Christ's action, and the focus or the target where these changes and things occur is the inner and the outer human being. Our feelings, our thoughts, our wills, but also how we behave. Rob identifies 3 tests for rational thinking. And so this is the disputing thoughts component of CBT psychotherapy. Logical consistency, or the basis of their validity and logic. Having beliefs being evaluated on an empirical fact, and beliefs are evaluated on long-term goals. So we challenge, disrupt, or dispute irrational thinking using these 3 things. And then, in evaluating the rationality or irrationality of these thoughts and beliefs, the critical questions: do these beliefs alleviate teleological distress? Do these beliefs facilitate the attainment of one's goals or accomplish one's telos? Do they work, in other words, right? Are they functional? Are they effective in helping me live the life that I feel that I should have? Right? And finally, a huge connection here is in terms of epistemology, on both Christian side and a cosmological side. So some Christian world discussion here is about general and specific revelation. So generally speaking, by studying creation, we can discern, according to Albert Wolters and others, God's imprint throughout nature. There are laws, right? Natural laws, patterns, regularities that lead to this idea of a purposeful creation, a consistent creation. And of course, the specific revelation in the Bible, and all culminating in Christ, allows us to discern, right? It reveals, right? It comes to us, it is revealed to us about God's Spirit. Now, this opens the role for scientific discovery. We can know and learn. Right? The original scientists in the Western world were Christians, and they used science to discover more and more truths about who God is and God's purpose for the world. And of course, from a Christian perspective, there are spiritual transcendent realities that we need to know. And so we are in this sense able to understand, both through revelation but also through science and the Spirit, more of God's nature. From CBT, the epistemology is naturalistic and empirical. There's only the natural world that we live in, and that natural world can only be known empirically. And so the context for that is the social exchange theory, and how that theory assumes that humans are profoundly rational. So as we are wrapping up this lecture, some things to consider. Do you believe it's true that humans are fundamentally rational creatures? And how does that rationality impact what we do, our activities, our relationality, our relationships? How easy or how hard is it to change humans in their behavior? And how does this relate to some of the Christian ideas that were developed briefly in this lecture? So take this example, the framework of cosmology, anthropology, doctrine of sin, and doctrine of the atonement, and think about how that relates to other kinds of behavioral science worldviews. What would a sociological approach be? Now, there are many sociological approaches, so don't think that just generally there's a blanket one. There are other approaches that aren't therapeutic for psychology. How do those things relate? So again, feel free to email me at tfrederick@calbaptist.edu with any questions or comments. Thank you.